complicated, you know, man. Like a damn Rubik's Cube, man. Like talking about that blue, red, man, then you get to one side, and like messed up.
All right, RedHawk. Welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, man. Thanks for having me. This is going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you on. So, for those who aren't familiar with you, could you describe, what you do online and kind of like what your perspective is?
Sure. So, I guess the best way, or the thing that people know me most for, is being a member of the Red Pill or the Manosphere community. Is kind of what I've got my bread and butter going for online. But then I also, spend my time in, dissident rights circles or whatever you want to call it. Member of the Old Glory Club, so you can see some of my work over there. And then also, kind of my passion project is I'm a big game hunter, so it's something that I enjoy very, very much. I've done many posts about it on my Substack and will continue to do so. And one of my goals going into next year is to start taking guys in our community on guided hunts to try and get them into the sport of hunting, because it really is one of those sports that has a very high barrier to entry. So I guess those are like the three camps that I spend time most in online circles.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up hunting because I'm a relatively new hunter. I started last year, and I was really lucky in the fact that I've done a lot of work, and I have a family friend who's a farmer, owns 100 or hundreds of acres and a couple hundred head of cattle, and so he has plenty of land, and basically was like, all right, like I'll teach you. But if I hadn't had that resource, I mean, you're right, it's incredibly difficult to get started.
Yeah. It, not only, first of all, it's very expensive, and then the second part of it as well is that there's so many. It's different than just going fishing, because number one, there's fish basically everywhere. They're kind of confined into a certain area. If you're like in your local neighborhood pond, it's not like they can run hundreds of yards away. You have multiple opportunities to catch them basically. You got to deal with things like hunter ethics, like your shot placement, what kind of equipment. You got to get up early in the morning, depending on what you're hunting. So yeah, I mean, it's a huge barrier to entry. And I was very fortunate in the fact that all the male members of my family are hunters, every last one of them. And so I was basically, baptized in this, for lack of a better word, since, I was a small boy. I mean, I got a BB gun when I was maybe 6 years old. I got my first rifle when I was 9. And I've just been in the woods hunting things basically since, I had a thought about it. It was just always something that I wanted to do. I saw my dad, my grandfather, and everybody, they'd be traveling around the country or around the world hunting big game, and they'd come back with these stories and everything. And it was just, it never really came into my mind that this is something I just wasn't going to do. It was just like part of who I was immediately. No two thoughts about it.
Yeah, I was definitely, I'm a part of a family that does a lot of fishing. My dad is kind of an expat, has been all over the world, fishing, and, same thing, a lot of great stories. But you're completely right that it is a different, they're both kind of field sports, right? But it's a different category of activity. And this is kind of a weird one to when on first inspection. But one of the most important things about like entering a new, endeavor, sport, whatever you want to say, is figuring out which one of the laws or which one of the rules are actually important and which one of them are kind of like the speed limit,
Yeah.
Because at least for me, right, like in my state, and this is all hypothetical, of course, I, follow every single law, but there are some laws where it's like, yeah, like just don't talk about it. Like, for instance, like there's a minimum caliber, but it's like, whatever, you're fine. And then there's other laws where it's like, no. If you break this law and someone finds out, you will go to jail. And obviously like that's specific to hunting, but you kind of see it in everything else too, like knowing like, okay, like what's actually important and what's just the stuff that they tell you, what the government tells you to do, if you get my drift.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my mind immediately goes to, there's certain laws that like you can only have a certain amount of rounds in your gun when you go into the field. Not that anyone's ever going to check that. Or you're only allowed to carry one weapon into the field. So if you're like a concealed carrier, you can't carry like a sidearm. I mean, like for Europeans, our European listeners, this is a conversation I have with them all the time, is that American wilderness is actually like really dangerous still. I mean, depending on where you are in the country, there's wolves, there's bears, there's cougars. There's a lot of dangerous game out there that would easily kill you if you gave it an upper hand. So it's not uncommon for people to walk around the woods with a sidearm plus their hunting rifle and stuff like this. And when I talk to guys like in the UK who basically just do a little bit of deer hunting and fox hunting, it's not remotely the same, caliber.
Well, and that's one of the things because I'm an East Coast guy, and our wilderness is much more pacified, than the people out west or in Alaska. So I realize there's a different order of magnitude, but I think people don't realize that this, and this sounds really like kind of woo woo and out there, but I think you'll agree with me that the spirit of the American woods is much more hostile than the European forest. It's kind of spooky, and there's places out there that if you get far enough out, no one else has ever been to. Whereas in a place like England, which people have just been for so long, at least civilized people have been there for so long, compared to, even the most civilized US states, it's a completely different ballgame.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's certainly some eerie feelings out there in the woods. I mean, and even in some of the more like popular areas. I mean, I went camping with our friend Yiz the Eunuch earlier this year, and so we went down south and on a campground that was still there's still a fair amount of people there, but we're far enough out in the middle of nowhere that you still get that eerie feeling when it's dark at night and you're getting out of the tent to go grab something or other, and just like you got the feeling that like there's eyes on you, there's something's out there, but it definitely is something of our ancestral past, and also just something going on in the Americas. I mean, there still is wild lands out here, which is something I absolutely love.
No, I do too. And there's something because again, like I didn't grow up in a hunting family, but there's something incredibly like primally satisfying about, and this is, it's just true about just, killing and eating an animal. It really like activates something kind of like deep in your masculine brain.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, number one, not only does it taste amazing, is the first part. I mean, it's better than anything you're going to get in the grocery store for sure. Give me a nice venison steak and I'll be happy for a long time. And then also, it's so interesting because I was talking before we came on air here that I took two guys out pheasant hunting a couple weeks ago, and it was the first time they've ever hunted before in their lives. And they were asking me like all these kinds of questions before we got out there. It's like, oh, so what do I got to do for this situation, and what are we doing for this and that and stuff like this. And just when you get out there and you take that first trigger pull, and you take life for the first time, it's not really like a squeamish thing that comes out in you. It really just is like a primal thing. It's like, oh, I'm literally just supposed to do this. This is just part of our our human story. We all came from this. Hunting is the human experience. We're the apex predators on the planet. So it's interesting. A lot of people would think like, oh well, how could you kill this cute pretty little animal thing? And it's not like a vengeful act or anything like that. It's just like it's part of me in the same way that breathing is, or drinking. It really just is that much to our core, I think.
Well, and to me, it very much kind of reminds me of, and I realize that the term and the community are not completely synonymous, right? But kind of like so many of the, very, baseline red pills that so many people in our field kind of take for granted because they're the revelation of 10 years ago, but so many of those baseline things are essentially the fact that like our society, right? Like our ruling caste want us to deny kind of core parts of human nature. They essentially want, and for men in particular, they want men to be kind of these, like neutered, gray, kind of formless, shapeless beings, who are essentially just slightly differentiated women, and things like that are kind of like primal and real are very dangerous to them. You see the same thing in all of the like the endless railing against things like like lifting weights or hanging out in large male groups, that they're almost instinctively threatened by these kind of like primal activities.
Yeah, absolutely. It's no secret that the regime does not want men to get together in groups. And even if they are able to hold on to certain groups, they immediately, we'll call them sexist or something, and try to insert women, into these spaces. And, actually, funny enough, I was having a conversation with cows, Panama Hats, companion, and we were having a conversation on one of Mr. D's Twitter Spaces, and she was telling a story about how she entered a cigar lounge, and it was just like a completely male space. And she was telling us about how she just felt the energy of the room immediately change, when a woman walked into the space. And I was talking to her about this as well, and I was saying like, women kind of have to understand it's not that guys hate women and we're not allowing them into the spaces. It's just that we know that some other guy in the space is immediately going to try and get in that girl's pants, and the entire energy and vibe of the space is immediately going to change. So it's not so much about like, oh, woman bad. It's about, this guy is about to go and betray us now and just completely destroy the whole feel of the space because he wants to get in this girl's pants. And it happens every single time with every single male space. The second that a woman gets in it, there's just going to be a guy that's going to change everything. I mean, and everybody experiences this, like with your group of friends. Um, you always like hang out on like a Friday or something, and then all of a sudden he gets a girlfriend, and then lo and behold, he doesn't start showing up to your Friday events anymore. So
Well, I think that you see it in like, at least personally, one of the traits I find most irritating in guys, if I'm hanging out with them, is that they completely change around women. Where
mhm.
it's like I have a friend, and obviously I won't say his name, but it's like, oh, there are two versions of this guy. There's him when it's the guys, and then the moment a woman enters in it, he's that guy who just, completely changes his priorities. And I think that again, that's something that it's almost so stupid that our ancestors wouldn't even have need to set it, or to say it rather. That these kind of all male spaces are incredibly important for male bonding. And I think that one of the most pernicious things you see, in kind of like modern media, or even just like modern, like conversation, is the idea that, oh, the only reason you want to have an all male space is essentially because you want to have sex with men. And you
Mhm.
see this in the discussion around any like group of male friends in the past. Like you see this with ancient literature all the time. Like, oh, like all the Homeric heroes, and admittedly, like Achilles and Patroclus probably were, but you know what I mean? The idea that like
Mhm.
any type of, you know, like kind of like friendly or competitive relationship between two men, what must have been sexual. Like it's a fundamental distortion of reality.
Mhm. Yeah, and my mind goes to other figures, like they try and say like Frodo and Sam, are gay or something. They just have to inject this, you know, uh, new woke way of viewing things into the conversation, and everything, because that's the only way they possibly could have done this. And I was talking to another one of our guys in our community, not me, not you, about this, and he said something very profound about this. Is that so often when you see these articles about literary characters, whether it's Homeric figures like you were saying, or the characters out of Tolkien or something like this, anything that refers to a masculine space, you see so often that these articles are coming from the mouths of women. And he made a very interesting point about this, and I tend to agree. It's like the the bond that men have between friendships is just simply not comparable to the bonds that women can have with other women. Like there are guys, and this is not an exaggeration. I would massacre so many people to save some of my guys if they were in need. Absolutely. Like they come into my house, bloody shovel. They're like, okay, we gotta go. I'm not asking any questions. This is it. It's something that is just so you know, a bond is so unbelievably strong, and it had to be that way, in our past, because we were warriors, we were hunters, we were killers. It's just part of who we are, and so not me, not you is saying that's like, oh, the only way that women can understand this is because from their own perspective of how they bond so much, women can only form this kind of bond with a lover or a husband, something like this. And so their perception of things must be, oh, then these guys just must have want to have sex because it's the only way they could perceive these kinds of things. Because I mean, like, look at any group of female friends. They you know, they hate each other, for lack of a better word. I mean, like they're backstabbing each other, they're talking behind each other's backs, they're kind of giving each other like, backhanded compliments and stuff when they're in the presence of each other, always jockeying for position. And, guys do this too, but it's more like a shit test. Like when you get into a group of dudes and everyone just starts making fun of each other, it's kind of a passive way for us all to acknowledge that, oh, you're one of us, you're one of our guys. I could rely on yours for something. If I can, sit here and call you a bunch of names and you're not gonna, throw fists at me, that means you're one of my boys.
Well, I completely agree, and I think that because if I'm not mistaken, I think you're roughly 4 or 5 years older than me. And I think that one of the things that happened, as guys our age went through school is that a lot of normal male bonding behavior became kind of problematized. Where that kind of system where you can just kind of you can basically have like a low level verbal conflict as a bonding mechanism. Well, that kind of got rolled into, bullying, quote unquote.
Mm,
And so, in addition to kind of the internet providing, a pull one direction and this like anti-bullying providing a push in the other, I think that in many ways we've seen this kind of like crisis of male friendship, where there are a lot of guys who just don't interact with anyone at all, except for maybe online.
yeah, this is 100% true, and it's something we're seeing, in the manosphere recently, and the sphere in 2022 has basically gone mainstream at this point. Now, there's many guys in the space in the sphere that think this is a bad idea. I'm kind of in that line of thinking on this, but we don't have to get too much into that. But we're seeing that basically it's becoming unignorable at this point because we have a generation of guys, the Zoomers now, who were basically entirely raised by women, who are now coming into their adult years, and they, number one, they've realized that they've been fed a bunch of lies. They don't know how to attract women. They don't know how to be friends with guys. They don't know how to be masculine. And so all of our spaces are just absolutely getting flooded with these guys now because they're lost and they don't know what to do. I mean, you saw the rise of figures like Jordan Peterson for the same exact reason.
No, I completely agree. And I think that and actually, before we get into that, can you define the term manosphere? Because I know what that is, but I realize that's kind of inside baseball.
Right. So it's kind of difficult to pin down because the term manosphere was never coined by the guys that were actually in the online space. It was coined by Jezebel as a hit piece against these guys, saying like, oh, there's a toxically masculine space, a manosphere, if you will. And, people have just kind of adopted the term anyway. And then, of course, the space was, called like the red pill before. And, there's people that will go back and forth with like Yarvin's sphere of influence, arguing who came up with the term first and stuff. But I guess basically what you can the manosphere, as we know it now, is basically described in two points. The first is positive male identity, and the second one is male sexual strategy, and that's basically it. There are a bunch of different factions within that sphere as well, that make up all the sort of different parts. But those are the two core tenets of what the manosphere is. So just positive male identity, which is like a completely masculine space free of women, and two is just male sexual strategy. So basically, guys swapping notes. How do we get laid?
Well, that's helpful because to me, I've been on the internet for a while, but I haven't really been on the political internet for more than, the last couple years. And so to me, I kind of primarily became aware of, the quote unquote red pill manosphere community through a lot of the, the hit pieces written about it. I didn't really interface with politics until, probably the 2017 era. So what kind of not drove you, that makes it sound too negative, but what kind of like introduced you to that community?
Mm, well, so often with so many cases with everybody in this space, they aren't attracted to it because things are going well for them. So basically, how I ended up getting into the space was my parents went through a nasty divorce when I was in my late teenage years, and that like I moved halfway across the country for college at that point, just to get away from it all, just to get away from everything. And I was lost. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I just wanted to get out of that situation. And I find myself in college not really knowing what I wanted to do, not being very successful with women. But I had a roommate who was very, very successful, and I basically started picking up things from him and learning throughout my college years. And eventually, when I really started to dive into more of like the red pill and manosphere stuff, was right after I graduated college, and then I don't even remember how this book got on my radar, but I picked up Rollo Tomasi's The First Rational Male book, and you know, it might have actually been when he went on Stefan Molyneux's show, because I was in like the political internet long before that. I was always kind of like basically basic normie con, and I like went through like the Daily Wire phase and like the libertarian phase, and I found myself in dissident right circles and stuff. But I think it actually was when Stefan Molyneux interviewed Rollo Tomasi on one of his shows. I think that's it. Yeah, if I really have to think back to it, I think that's where the first book came on my radar. And then I started down that path. And at that point, I had already kind of gotten more successful with girls. But then when I read the book, I was like, oh, okay. The way I describe it to people the first time, when I'm telling them the story, is that I was basically shooting a gun without knowing the inner mechanics of how a firearm works. And then when I read Rollo Tomasi's book, I was like, oh, okay, so this is why this works, and this is why this works, and this is why this doesn't work. And so basically, I'm like, oh, okay, so now you pull the trigger and it strikes the firing pin, which, and launches the cartridge forward. So yeah, that's basically how I describe it to people.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that one of the difficult things about the position that we find ourselves in is that from a certain perspective, right, the right is traditional. But the problem is that the chain of civilization has been broken, kind of several generations back. I kind of blame the silent generation. Maybe you can blame another. But the kind of tried and true strategy of, well, just ask, your parents, or just ask your grandparents. Maybe some of us are lucky enough that that's still a viable strategy. But for so many of us, right, you get the kind of like, you get the like ask women Reddit answers, where it's like, oh, just be an extra, stand up guy, and, maybe get a haircut, get a nice beard, which are, I mean, probably not going to hurt you, but you're fundamentally that good instinct of, asking, your elders has kind of been closed off to us. And so I think a lot of us kind of have that same realization of like, oh, wait, like if I'm going to find, a solution to these problems, I'm going to have to go much farther afield, than previous generations did looking for solutions.
Yeah, it's very true. We basically had three, arguably four generations at this point, where it's basically been the blind leading the blind as it relates to, intersexual dynamics and family formation and everything like this. And this isn't to, make fun of or dogpile on our parents or anything like that. I mean, they did their best, quite frankly, as far as I'm concerned. It's just not productive for us to, blame them for not teaching us these things because, they were pretty lost themselves. So the question then comes down to what are you going to do about it? And this is kind of, a point of contention I have with, a faction of manosphere people called like the MGTOWs, men going their own way. And there's a rich history with that community as well. But basically what it's been diluted to at this point is a bunch of guys who are just checking out right at 18, are seeing the horrible divorce statistics and seeing, women in the abstract on Twitter, basically, being obsessed with OnlyFans and everything. And they just decided to, check out of everything and not take part in anything like this, and kind of, for lack of a better word, play victim. And basically my response to that is like, yes. Is it true that you were lied to? Absolutely. Is it true that the system is rigged against men? Yes, that is true as well. Is it true that the women of today are not the women of 50, 60, 70 years ago? Yes, that is true as well. However, you just have to come to peace with the fact that you are a man. You are the disposable sex in our species, and it's just how it goes, and it will always be that way. So you basically just need to suck it up and figure out how you are going to adjust your life and your actions accordingly to succeed in this new, paradigm that's presented to you.
Well, I agree with everything you said there. And I think that because, for those who aren't aware, you're a controversial figure in our circles, right? Like you get a lot of hate. And
yeah,
some of it, it's like, because obviously, like we have fundamentally different ideas about a lot of topics. But what you just said, I completely agree with. Fair enough, maybe towards different ends. But I've had I couldn't agree more. And I found myself incredibly disgusted with, and you see it primarily on like Chan culture, in that kind of like segment of the world, where it's essentially incels, not in the derogatory term, people who self-describe themselves as incels, who basically want to be added to the progressive stack as another victim group.
Hmm.
They basically want, like, instead of a, government mandated GF, they basically want, like, my life is so over that I want Gibbs, and to me, that's kind of like the ultimate, like, level of patheticness, because, like, you realize that the system is truly rigged against you, which it is, and your response is basically to, like, turn over on your back, and it's just say, like, oh, whatever you want, it's just as long as I get some welfare out of it. Have you seen those guys around before?
Yeah, there's absolutely a large faction of people that are like that. Part of me, to an extent, again, I really don't like the term blame, because I just don't really think it's productive. But at the same time, I can't really. It's certainly not something I would do, but I can't fault these guys. Some of them are coming from single mother homes in the projects, who have never had a male figure in their entire lives, and are just wondering, why the hell am I lost? Why the hell is nothing working for me? I've been fed everything, to me has been total lies, and they're now in their mid 20s, living at home with no job prospects, with no mate prospects. And I could definitely see why some people would just want to check out of everything. I don't encourage people who follow me to do that at all, because I think it's the easiest time in all of human history to be a top 20% man. Just for the simple fact that your competition is just basically doing nothing. One of my favorite statistics to bring up all the time is that 70% of Americans are overweight or obese. So literally, if you were just a normal size, that's not even six pack abs or anything like that, you're already in the top 30%. So I
Well,
it's so easy to separate yourself from the sludge, as far as I'm concerned. And yes, it's going to be a lot of hard work, and yes, it's going to suck, but to be honest, it's better than the alternative.
well, I completely agree with you, and you see some in those spheres so much of the, like, the doomer posting of, like, oh, like, if you're not the top 2%, you're completely hopeless. And you're completely right in the sense that, like, okay, it's hard to look like a Greek god. It takes a lot of work. It takes some genetics. Like, you really have to, like, be gifted. But to be not fat, that's relatively easy. It's just fork put downs till failure, right? Like, just don't eat. And again, like you said, we live in a time where, much like you said earlier, that the women around now are not the women of 70 years ago. Well, neither are the men. And so you
Mm,
can either look at that as, like, oh, like, like the Chud Jack meme, the West has fallen, or, like, well, to be honest, like, it's never been a better time to be a go-getter, really. And, like, fair enough, maybe it's not as easy for you in certain areas. Like, okay, you don't have essentially, like, a pre-built system to meet someone for a relationship. Maybe you're going to face, like, real legal discrimination at, the workplace and education. Like, fair enough. But it's not all bad. And, look, like, every, like, disgusting Reddit new mail is, to be honest, it's one less guy you got to worry about.
yeah, absolutely. That's something that people will see on my Twitter account a lot when I'm talking to other manosphere guys. We kind of have a maxim that we like to use a lot. We say let them burn, in the sense of, you can only save the people that really want to be saved. Especially with guys, they have to be willing to put the work in themselves, because, as I was mentioning before, and you can basically just summarize it like this: like, you're not a young blonde with big boobs, so the world isn't going to take care of you. And if you can either live with that, or you can cry about it, or whatever you want to do, but just the facts are the facts, and they're not going to change. No amount of screaming about men's rights is ever really going to change any of that. So just go out, do the best you can. You're going to fail, but there's plenty of guys out there that can help you through it if you want to learn. And there's going to be a lot of learning involved, but so much of what we're talking about here is my buddy Ryan Stone. He says this all the time. One of the premier guys in the manosphere that everybody should go check out. He does some fantastic work. But one of the things he says is that men are being raised as defective women, and that's 100% true. And you see this in all of the mental models that guys are fed when they're little kids. Whether it comes down to the Disney fairy tale of how your parents met, I think a lot of guys are fed this false idea that your mom and your dad just got together because the stars aligned and it was, ordained by, the heavens and the stars. When really what it probably was is that both of your parents most likely went through a lot of relationships beforehand. They found each other because they were really attracted to each other at a certain point at a certain time, and then they decided to date and things would work out, and that's how you got there. It wasn't like, oh, a love at first sight thing. It's more like a lust at first sight. So I think that's one problem the guys have to deal with. And a second thing is just this mental model of being raised as a defective girl. I see this all the time when guys are, coming to me for advice and they're like 22, 23, sometimes even younger, and they basically think their life is over because, they don't have a girlfriend or they don't have a wife or anything like this. And that's such a feminine way of looking at things, because men's sexual market value peaks much later in life because it just takes much longer for you to develop things that are attractive to the opposite sex as a man. Things like, home ownership, a good paying job, fitness, just charisma. One of the things we like to call is frame, so just like establishing your own, world that everyone else is around for, everyone else is along for the ride, basically. So things like this take a long time to develop. And as you grow older as a guy, through your 20s into your 30s, your sexual selectivity goes up. When as you're a woman, your sexual selectivity goes down because the wall is getting ever so closer. The fertility is going down. Your looks aren't as good as they used to be. So with guys fed this false mental model, they tend to freak out and think everything's the end. It's like, no, just work really hard in your 20s, and then when you get to your 30s, things are going to be fantastic, and you're going to have no issue dating women that are significantly younger than you. This has been a staple throughout all of history.
Well, and I think that's one of the especially pernicious things about modern media. And this is actually kind of a through line both from hunting and then also through relationships, is this kind of denial of the physical. It's like it's weirdly Gnostic, where it's like the part of you that's really, you, to be slightly redundant. Well, that's just like a little spark of magic in a meat suit, and then anything that comes from, the flesh, right? Anything of that, like that primal, like lizard brain. Well, that's something to be, kind of suspected to a certain degree. And I think you see that very much in the way that, Disney-fied relationships are described, where it's like, oh, you'll just feel something inside of you. You'll just feel this kind of like magical feeling, and that will not only last, but carry you through, a lasting relationship. And it's essentially this idea that like nothing hard can be worthwhile. You see this in the attitude towards exercise, and in much the same way with like a relationship, where it's like, look, if you want a relationship to last, it's not going to last off of, essentially like, 1950s Walt Disney, infatuation. Like that's fake to begin with, and even if it's not, it doesn't last long. And again, and it's like I feel bad because both men and women are essentially handed broken tools and told to go fix themselves. And so it's no shock that we have so much just dysfunction in this kind of like essential part of society.
Yeah, 100% true. Back where you were talking about how just attaching yourself, with I don't want to say like love conquers all, but it's just the thing that's coming to my brain. But back where I was talking about how being raised as defective girls, that's a very feminine way of looking at a relationship. Success for the woman in the relationship is giving herself to the man, attaching herself to him, and getting on his program so that he takes care of her. It's just how things go. But it's very dysfunctional for a guy to think that way. It's been told so often for a young guy that like, your wife or your girlfriend should be like the number one thing in your world. And I'm firmly in the camp that this is extremely destructive advice. And I think it destroys a lot of guys mentally when they're starting a relationship, and they tend to just almost like fangirl over this one girl. They get really obsessive. We call it one-itis in our spheres, where, you just dream up all these extravagant situations in your brain. Like 10 minutes after meeting this first girl, you're thinking about, picnics and walks and the kids you're going to have and the wonderful marriage and everything like this. And it gets you to be really, really needy and really clingy. and it's just not attractive. That's attractive quality in a woman, to attach yourself to a guy. No guy ever really complains about that unless you get into, some really psycho girls, but that's a different story. But you understand what I'm getting at here? It's like the mental framework that people are given is, just not going to work for them because, newsflash, men and women aren't the same. We're attracted to different things.
Well, and this is actually something that I really despise about kind of like the House conservatives, like the court jesters of the regime, is that they get all bent out of shape, like so exasperated about, biological differences between men and women when it comes to things that are almost completely unimportant, like women's sports.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to things like, representation in the workplace or, the kind of like roles of men and women in society, they have still swallowed, that premise of the equality of the sexes hook, line, and sinker. They've just like, and I'm sure right? Like there's a point where if you're fishing, right? If a fish actually swallows the hook, you can't get it out.
Yeah.
It is so far, it is behind the throat, you can't get it out. And so to a certain extent, that's kind of how I view, so many of the, the kind of just like normie conservatives, is that they scream and cry about, like critical race this and gender ideology. But when you look back one layer, you see that they have swallowed that, that poison, that barb, completely. It's just that they haven't quite realized it yet. They haven't really thought through their own principles.
Yeah, exactly. Republicans are the real feminists. Yeah. Yeah, all that nonsense. No, you're 100% correct. I mean, you can see all this play out in real time all the time. Is that so much of the conservative kind of man up talk response to our issues with young men and with women as well. Whether it's women not being able to find husbands and such like this. The question always comes down to like, men need to man up. Well, if you're going to tell men to man up, you need to give them the authority to go with that. And this is something I really like to harp on when I'm, fighting with trads on Twitter, as it were, is that if you're going to say that men need to, take responsibility in the world, they need to get up there, get out of the basement, put down the Cheetos, start making this economy rolling again and everything like this. Well, you need to give them the authority that goes along with that. And that means authority not over just themselves, but also more crucially, authority over their families that they're looking to have. So that means you need to, take the man's side first, in many of these circumstances. I mean, we see this all the time, even with most of the establishment conservative, media companies. The second that a Me Too case comes up, the guy is immediately fired within 5 seconds, and then the woman's side is always, take it for granted or everything. I remember this was a big deal when I think it was like 1 or 2 years ago when Matt Walsh was railing against Governor Kristi Noem in South Dakota, and he was basically telling her like, "Oh, you should actually use your power and not just be a pretty face." And immediately Kristi Noem came out and said, "Misogynist Matt Walsh," and a bunch of other like conservatives on Fox News were calling Matt Walsh a misogynist. And it's like, no. Let the men talk. So the men are here. We're going to, save you from yourselves. Because whether we're men and women like to admit it or not, women are pretty bad at making decisions, especially when it relates to large groups of people throughout a government. I mean, your girlfriend and your wife can't even decide what she wants to have for dinner tonight, and you want to put her in charge of a multimedia corporation or a government. It's just a bad idea. So if you're going to say men got to man up, it's like, well, are you prepared to give them authority for that? Are you prepared for the man to have control over his daughter and over his wife, with her decision making, with the finances of the household? And that's going to it's going to be a lot of interesting questions that people don't want to answer.
Well, and this is something that I really agree with. So I need to have him on to talk with him, but I fundamentally disagree with Anglo-Ortho about a number of things. But he's completely right when he basically says that like the dialectic is a synthesis. That phrase dialectical synthesis is around for a reason. And the idea that you can simply go back to a previous state of existence is moronic. And so when it comes to things like, the sexual revolution, I mean, the cat's out of the bag.
Mm-hmm.
We can come to different solutions afterwards. We can say like, all right, well, how do we integrate this into into kind of a different vision moving forward? But the idea that we can just turn the clock back to, 1870, or 1270, it's it's just not how time works. And that doesn't mean, that there is this kind of like Whig history, like eternal progress. That's not what I'm saying, but you're completely right. And there are just certain things that it's like, you can LARP as a trad all day, but if you try to be a trad in certain ways, you will end up in prison. It's not really a sustainable, a sustainable life path. And just recommending that people do something that's essentially impossible, that doesn't really accomplish anything. And I say this as someone who is, probably counts themselves, among the trads to a certain degree, right? It's just at a certain point unrealistic.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think definitely, definitely on a mass scale for sure. I think there definitely can be, circumstances, especially with people in our community, which I think has an issue of selection bias to some extent. When a lot of guys are online saying, "Oh, guys should be getting married," right thing, first girl they meet out of college and something like that, and um, man up and homeschool their kids and make a lot of money and stuff. I mean, I agree that it is a admirable goal. I just don't really think that it's applicable on a large scale. Not to say I disagree with the overall ends. I think I just disagree on the means of getting there. I mean, there's plenty of guys I talk to in the manosphere space that arguably have the trad starter kit. They're family men with good wives and good relationships. They have kids. Some of them are Christians. They still have very active sex lives with their wives. They have very good polarity in their relationships. He's the leader of the household. But how did he get to this space? Well, he got to this space through means that a lot of trads wouldn't really agree with. Well, so again, like, are we? I guess I'm kind of making like an ends justify the means argument here to an extent, but it's just, the times they are changing. It's basically all I can say.
Well, right, and we're stuck in a weird position here, because again, right, like one of I think like the unifying beliefs on the right is that there is this kind of like inherent human nature, and we can kind of disagree about what specifically that entails, but I think that really one of the main arguments we're aligned against is this kind of like tabula rasa view, where every human is just entirely created by constructs, right? There's nothing real or inherent. I say that's a widely held position across our across our friends. But also we're in situations where we're kind of we're in uncharted territory to a certain degree. And obviously there are behaviors we see across time. There's a a lively conversation about kind of like cyclical history. Like, oh, are we in a period of decline? Well, probably. And those kind of tend to have these results. But there are just kind of material conditions that you can't get around. Well, like birth control, that's a huge one.
Mm-hmm.
That allows women to act like men sexually. That just would have not been possible. And look, I'm not, some prude. I understand, right, that, people have always had affairs. People were up to plenty of things, in the Middle Ages. You can, look for your own sources on that. But nonetheless, like the widespread, sex culture we have now just would not be possible without that invention. And so that's a case, again, where now we have to kind of renegotiate the rules, because that essentially offers both sexes kind of a tool to screw the other one over.
Yeah.
Like if you're a woman and you're in a committed relationship, well, your man could be cheating on you with no consequence, right? You'd never know because there'd never be a baby. And on the other end, the same thing for a man. You essentially both now have the ability to essentially screw the other person over. So it is a weird, almost like prisoner's dilemma.
Yeah, very much so. And this is kind of where I get into a lot of arguments with trad characters who want to, go back to these times that we had. And I argue whether or not those times were really as good as they say they were. I tend to think that a lot of trads view, the relationships between men and women in the past often with like, rose tinted glasses, but that's besides the point. But the simple fact of the matter is that, those behaviors and such were developed in a time when certain incentives were on the table and certain technology wasn't in place. So things like the Industrial Revolution hadn't happened, where now women can enter into the workforce. We can argue of whether or not that's a good idea or not, but for us, being the dissidents on the internet here, we're not really in a position to change that. Same thing with the birth control pill. I mean, it's here and it's here to stay, whether we like it or not. And it's becoming so infectious in this point that there was a study that came out recently that the birth control is so endemic now that they can't even get it out of the tap water in our water supply because they can't filter out the estrogen in women's urine from the water supply. So now, like, the water is literally turning people gay, to quote Alex Jones. But it's so how are we going to tackle with this? Well, you can't just tell everybody that, you got to find this trad wife girl in the church. And it's like, okay, well, what if my church is paused in my area and there's, not many women for me to choose from? And what if those women, just simply are attracted to me? What if it doesn't work for me? It's not like I can club her over the head and carry her into my cave, because if she doesn't come with me, the saber-toothed tiger is going to eat her. Those times are gone. So how do we tackle with this? I mean, we've got social media now, so the sexual marketplace is now global at this point. It's not like, oh, you're just limited to the the mates that were within a 20-mile radius of you, like it was for the previous, 10,000 years of human history. It's like, now it's literally global now. So what are we going to do with that?
Well, right. And I'll admit something here. I actually didn't finish your most recent appearance with AA because I found it incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, I thought it was very frustrating.
And again, I'm friends with everyone in that conversation, so I won't be making comments about it past that. But to me, I thought the person who probably had the most the take I most agreed with was Mr. Patriarch, because he's someone who is, obviously he's a trad, he's an Orthodox Christian, but to me, he kind of struck the most, I guess, realistic take on it, which is that this idea that, like, there's this kind of, like, blonde, floral dress wearing, trad wife out there, running through a wheat field. Like, that's just not how real life works, And so, like, to be honest, like, if you are interested in pursuing a version of tradition, something more traditional than what is kind of readily presented to you, well, you're going to you can do that, but that not only requires you to make sacrifices, but it requires a great deal of personal risk, right? Like, the divorce system, the system of laws are against you, and that's a risk you have to take. And so I feel like, to me at least, it's one thing if you go into that kind of, like, knowing what you're signing up for, but I do, and this is from someone who lives in kind of one of the evangelical capitals of the world, right? I see so many guys whose hearts are in the right place, like they're kind of coming into this blind, and they're expecting reality to be a slightly, to essentially be, 1950, but with smartphones. They do get married at age, 22. They do, essentially find this first girl. And for some of them, it works out, and those guys are doing well. I have a lot of friends like that, but I see guys who don't understand the game that they're playing, and essentially go into this like go into this blind and get absolutely just chewed up and spit out. And I feel a lot of sympathies for those guys, because they're at least in my system of values, right? They're doing the right thing, but they're essentially like lambs to the slaughter to a certain point. And I maybe just want to, I maybe I'm overly paranoid, but I hate to see that every time, because that is someone who's essentially doing everything right.
Yeah, I more or less agree with your position wholeheartedly. I argue that the reason why the divorce laws, or the divorce statistics rather, are so bad is not necessarily because of the laws. I think it is for the reason that you've just described, that so many guys go into it blind and they just don't know. Either they don't have the skills or they haven't been taught, which is probably more likely the case in most of these cases. They just haven't been taught as to what a long-term relationship with a woman entails, what it means to be a leader, what it means to take charge of a household and a relationship, what it means to have these kinds of charisma skills and everything like this to, for lack of a better word, keep a woman in line, because they literally are chaos manifest. That's not to, like rag on the woman and like, oh, they're bad and stuff like that. It's just, no, they're emotional creatures. And so many guys have been fed this, uh, egalitarian nonsense from when they were young kids, thinking that women think the same way that they do, which is what I see so often with so many of these trads. And I thought it myself. I mean, I was baptized Catholic and Orthodox. I got a double dosage. So, and I saw this in both of those cases there, is that the guys just went into these circumstances basically as lambs to the slaughter, because they were under the impression that women that they were with, um, they have a concept of ideology, of honor, of religion, of laws, of codes of conduct, in the same way that men do. And they simply just do not. Just because, the women they're eternally ruled by their feelings. And again, that's not to rag on them or something. It's just literally what they are. And if you understand what they are, you can act accordingly and change your tactics, to have the kind of great, trad, wonderful life that you want. But just to expect your woman to basically just stay there, obey her man because, the Bible says so, is just ridiculous, because it's not the way women view the world.
Well, and it actually, and I've made multiple comments on this in the last couple of weeks, because it drives me up the walls crazy. We're essentially men, and particularly, shall we say, neurodivergent types interested in politics. They want a woman with their exact same niche interests.
Yes, it's
Essentially, just
nonsensical.
a dude with boobs. And let me tell you, that person doesn't exist. You are wasting your time. There are probably a few thousand people in the world, roughly half of them will watch this video, who are interested in obscure Italian elite theorists. I'm just going to be honest with you. Like, the numbers are not in your favor. And so hoping that you can essentially go on a first date, like mutter something about the JQ, and then 2 years from now, you'll have you have a crop of healthy sons. It's ridiculous. And so like there is kind of a bell curve, you can work with, right? Like, you're looking for someone as, a guy on the right who has at least like ideas that will not end with you in prison, so like, okay, the blue-haired girl, with problem glasses, and pronouns, probably not a safe bet, avoid that one. But like the normie girl, who went to a USC school, and whose dad has a MAGA hat, okay, maybe she's not exactly currently, super woke on, Steve Saylor racial science, but like, you'll probably be fine.
Yeah.
And so I realize it may not be the biggest problem in the world, but it's something that I see, so many of the guys in our sphere like make essentially an easy mistake, pass up easy opportunities, and for what, right?
Yeah, they're basically all looking for Murdoch Chan, basically.
Right, and that's a joke because it doesn't exist. Like,
Exactly.
they missed why it was funny.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I tell people all the time when they're asking these kinds of questions, first of all, like, a good woman isn't found, especially in 2022. A good woman is made. There's definitely, to continue with this analogy, I mean, there's definitely like clay that's easier to mold than others. But the simple fact of the matter is, and I firmly believe this, by the way, I mean, maybe my internal misogyny is coming out, but I do not believe that women can have values outside of a man, in the sense of that they are entirely formed by, some kind of sculptor, and that is always a man, whether it's a father, a husband, a boyfriend, some other male in a position of authority in their lives. They're always molded by something. And it's not their own thoughts in 99% of cases. So I'm firmly in the camp that if you find a girl who's, apolitical, somewhere on the right, or even just a basic bitch, leftist who really hasn't thought about politics, but, was just kind of taught that feminism was good. It's like, if you're a guy who's on his game, who has his, shit together, for lack of a better word, is charismatic, is charming, is attractive, how to hold a conversation. Part of women's mating strategy is literally just to like mold her opinions to match yours. How many guys have had this experience when they're dating a girl and she'll start listening to the same kind of music you like, or will start asking you questions about, some brand that you enjoy or something like this. It's just literally part of women's nature to latch on to a man. So yes, you can mold their political positions relatively easily if you just know what you're doing. And again, a big reason why people don't want to do it is because they don't want to put in the work. And to put in the work, you got to develop yourself, and then you also have to develop these kinds of tactics and skills that will be used, later to actually, mold a girl to be what you want her to be.
Well, that's well said, man. We're coming up on time. So if people want to find more of your work, where can they find you?
You guys can find me in 3 places. First, you can find me on Twitter at RedPilledHawk. You can find me on my own YouTube channel, RedHawk. My main show is Man's Hour. It's every Thursday, so we go over there and talk for an hour, talk about men's issues and such. And then you can also find my work at the Old Glory Club. So I do some streams with those guys, and then also put out Substack content. So check us out over there. We're putting out a lot of good stuff. And thanks for having me, man. This is a great conversation.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too. Again, like I should say, like I'm the trad, right? But there's a certain point of infighting that's just not productive. Like we agree on the vast majority of these topics, maybe to slightly different ends. And I'm really glad this conversation happened. I thought it was a fun one, and I think that hopefully, we can have another one in the future, because this was really productive. I feel like we really got somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime, man.
Yeah, thank you. So anyway, guys, my stuff, obviously my links will be down in the description, to my socials and all that. We have a Telegram, and you should hop in. It's an absolute rolling disaster, but it's kind of fun, right? Additionally, this episode will be available on Apple, Spotify, anywhere you listen to audio episodes. And I have a scheme set up where the 10 most recent episodes are available for free on Apple and Spotify. But if you want my audio backlog after it drops out of that top 10, well, you're going to have to throw me some money, and you can do that either through Subscribestar or through the paid feature on Substack. All roads essentially lead to the same destination there. Everything, including, the non-numbered, more casual streams, those are going to be available on my YouTube, so long as I have it. And anyway, guys, I appreciate you coming out for this one. And remember, keep your head up. A lie can't last forever. Good night.